All right, it looks like we've hit critical mass here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for attending. This is the Failure Modes and Adaptations workshop hosted by Baringa. My name is Paul Sayor. I'm the main contact for the Gracie West program, and I will be running this webinar with my colleague Michael Levy as well. This will be an hour-long session today, and it will be recorded. So if you have other people who you think would benefit from this information and cannot make it today, it's going to be posted publicly on the GDO website. That's the plan as of right now, and it'll be accessible through that. We'll have 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. If you guys have questions during the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll have Casey try to address them on a rolling basis. If not, then we'll chat about them at the end of the call. But if you have any larger questions, feel free to save them. We'll have some time to discuss them. So without further ado, I want to get through the agenda here. We have a bit of a packed agenda. First, we'll go through a larger project update for Gracie. Where we'll review the status of the project and where we're at. Then I'll hand it over to Michael to go through some of the objectives of the webinar, and then we'll get into the lion's share of the material, which is the failure modes and hazards discussion, and talking about them in the context of a few historical climate disasters that we've experienced in the U.S. Then we'll end with a section on selecting adaptations and some question and answer. So just so this can be a standalone webinar and made publicly available, I just want to quickly review the purpose of Gracie. Baringa has been selected by the GDO to provide technical assistance to 11 states in the West on how to better understand exposure to extreme weather events in the context of the 40101D funding. This webinar is part of phase 2, where we'll be creating custom reports for each state based on climate projections, where we investigate the risk posed to certain energy asset classes from extreme weather. We've actually finished all of the reports for each state, and we've done a few of the readouts already. At this point, every state should have a scheduled readout. If you guys do not, please reach out to myself or Casey after the call, and we'll go ahead and get that scheduled. It should just be an hour session where we're reviewing the findings, getting your feedback, and then we'll be able to iterate one more time on a final copy. In terms of timeline, again, this is a year-long project. We're about a third of the way through, closing up on phase 2 here and going to start phase 3. Phase 3 is our current and future state of grid report, and that involves nomination with some utilities. We've actually had really high interest from the utilities that we've talked to, and we're kind of closing in on our 11 utility cap for this phase of the project. So if there are any last minute nominations, or if you really think a utility would benefit from being involved in this phase, feel free to reach out to me after the call, and we'll see if we have capacity to include them in the study. So with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Michael Levy, to review the objectives of the workshop.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. When we think about the energy trilemma, it's frequently described as this balance between sustainability, affordability, and reliability. The focus of this discussion, obviously, primarily on the bottom part of this, really around reliability. And if you think about the way that the grid has been operated historically, and now the new risks that it's facing, you've got unprecedented demand growth, but then competing for the capital similarly is also capital to address resilience or hardening from extreme weather. And so because investments, the demand for capital is growing and kind of challenged more than it has been historically, our view is that you really want to have a robust and detailed understanding of what the risk is and how it's specific to each of the assets so that you can ensure that the capital that you're spending is optimally allocated against the affordability constraints that you have. And so when we think about why it's important to model asset failure, the end goal is, as I had mentioned, both substantiating asset investment plans to the regulator or the board via benefit cost analysis or an NPV, whatever sort of metric that you're using to establish efficiency of capital deployment, but also just making sure that you have the confidence that you're buying down risk in the most effective way possible because adaptation, as most know on this call, is a fraction of the cost of restoration. And so if you're suboptimally allocating your capital to buy down risk, then it's going to end up costing your customers more, what I should say, utilities customers more in the long run. And so if you accept those premises as being true, then working backwards from that, you need to understand what's the universe of adaptations that I could consider and then what is the mix of those that optimally buys down the risk. And then, of course, the risk needs to be forecast based on future climate needs as opposed to looking at those historically. And so, this slide is really just explaining why why we think it's important for the utilities to quantify risks at the asset level, and then ensure that the adaptations that they're considering are optimized against that. And this presentation that Paul's going to be sharing today is really going to highlight instances where certain energy companies were perhaps unprepared for the types of extreme weather that they were facing and the types of adaptations that they may have considered to have addressed those needs to prevent those types of catastrophic events from happening in the future.
Yeah, thanks for the level setting there. I think that teases up really well to jump into the failure modes and hazards portion here. And again, just to reiterate, what we're trying to do is establish an idea of how assets fail, so that we can look at the sort of art of the possible when it comes to mitigations and adaptations, and make sure that we're quantifying that failure to arrive at a confident investment plan that buys down the most risk for the least dollars. And we think that the best way to contextualize all of this is through stepping through a few historical climate disasters, and to help bring it to life. So we've chosen 4 climate disasters here, and the reason why we chose them are, one, because we think they're a good representation of the different asset classes that we as energy stakeholders interact with on the grid, and also a good representation of the hazards that we see. And then number 2, these events in particularly over the past few years have fundamentally changed how we view the grid, view resilience and reliability, and our planning functions as well. So something to note here is some of these assets might not be exactly applicable, the climate disasters might not be applicable to exactly what you experience in the West because many of you are, Western states here. However, the hazards that are brought about by these climate disasters, mainly looking at Hurricane Beryl here, which we experienced in the southeast portion of the United States in July. These hazards are the same. It's extreme wind, and the way that the assets fail is also the same. So whether or not the extreme wind is brought about by a hurricane or brought about by a winter storm in the mountains, say in Tahoe, the assets impacted and the way in which they fail will be the same. And so the learnings taken from Hurricane Beryl is applicable here. And just to cover the 4 events that we chose, first we have the Pacific Northwest heat wave, and we'll be talking about how that impacted generation and networks. Then we have wildfire, and that is primarily the Dixie Fire we'll be talking about in July of 2021 and its impact on PG&E's distribution infrastructure. Then we'll cover Winter Storm Elliott, which happened in December of 2022, and we'll be discussing its impacts on generation and networks. And then finally, we'll be ending with Hurricane Beryl and how extreme wind caused significant poles and structure failure.
And as Paul steps through these different case studies, definitely would love to hear from you guys the extent to which you've the utilities within your own states have experienced similar hazards and you know whether that raised awareness or drove criticality in terms of the types of investments or shifted the priority of the types of adaptations that were considered.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. Our first climate disaster here is the Pacific Northwest heat wave. So in July of 2021, there was a severe high pressure system that came over the Pacific Northwest region of the US, causing a heat dome effect, and that yielded extreme increases in temperature. The region saw about 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit above the normal temperatures that they experience for that time of year. And just as a side note, you know, climate scientists that we've talked to saw this event as virtually impossible. You know, the return period was infinity, yet it still, you know, occurred, and energy stakeholders had to reckon with that. So during the actual extreme heat event, BPA and other plant owners had to bar maintenance to prevent service interruption. And then there were significant demand spikes. You know, increased electrification of air conditioning and cooling caused summer peaking to be record breaking at around 33,000 megawatts. Coincidentally, that actually was broken a few years later with this past heat wave that we had, coming in at 33,300 megawatts for summer peak for the region. But regardless, this event fundamentally changed how we view resilience in the region, and also led to other planning documents and resource adequacy changes. But diving into exactly how the grid was affected during this event, there was sort of a four-pronged approach across a variety of asset classes, and that can be illustrated to the graphic on the right in pink. The first effect that I want to talk about is the effect that heat has on generation. So primarily thermal electric plants. So you have steam turbine coal, natural gas, and nuclear that have cooling, whether it's once through cooling or cooling towers, are affected by extreme heat because that cooling efficiency decreases, and thus decreases the actual supply and the nameplate capacity that these assets can generate. So overall, there's a derating effect from extreme heat on generation. And that happens when you actually need the supply the most, right? During these extreme events, like we talked about, there's extreme demand spikes due to air conditioning usage. And that's illustrated on the blue house on the bottom. There's an increase in demand. And so you have this demand supply mismatch. And to complicate things further, there are significant network impacts to transmission and distribution. On the transmission side, there are violations during extreme heat events of the thermal ratings, causing grid operators to derate the lines and derate the capacity that is throughput. And similarly, on the distribution side, that happens as well. There's conductor violations, but also on the distribution side, there is equipment, specifically transformers, that if they don't have the opportunity to cool down during at night during minimums, you know, those assets will be highly utilized, and it'll drive them to failure quite quickly. So, like I said, there's this four-pronged impact where there's a demand supply mismatch, and the capacity and your transference ability is also decreased. We've actually quantified those effects to the left in the blue box, if you guys are interested in seeing exactly what the relationship is between temperature and derating and failure. And this is really important to to use during modeling and failure modeling when you're trying to arrive at how assets sort of behave and the risk to them during these events. One way to help solve this problem, though, is making sure that when you do conduct this modeling, planners and other stakeholders use climate adjusted inputs that take into account these temperature changes and these extreme events going forward. So, for example, production cost modelers and capacity expansion modelers need to use climate adjusted demand projections to figure out resource adequacy plans. Alternatively, transmission planners, when they do the power flow analysis, need to take into account conductor thermal capacity violations when they're looking to assess where the most efficient routes for power to flow. So that was the Pacific Northwest heat wave and the impacts to generation and networks. And so we'll move on to wildfire. We're covering the Dixie Fire. There's a lot of wildfires that the West has experienced, specifically California, but we decided to choose this one particularly because of the ignition cause. Essentially, in July of 2021, a PG&E line worker approached on routine inspection, approached a 12 kV conductor and saw that there was a Douglas pine that had collapsed on top of the conductor, causing 2 of the 3 fuses to blow. Unfortunately, that turned into a fire that wasn't able to be contained and ended up being one of the most expensive fires to mitigate in California history, burning about 1 million acres. So the cause is from vegetation management issues, but I think there is sort of a success coming out of this, and this is the sort of action that PG&E had to take. And so I want to discuss the adaptations that were a result of the Dixie Fire. One of them being sort of the undergrounding program that PG&E has committed to. Not just the Dixie Fire, Camp Fire, other major events in the West have caused PG&E to commit to around 10,000 miles of power lines being undergrounded. But I think an interesting outcome of this particular fire was that the CPUC mandated PG&E to actually start digitizing their inspection records. And when we think about adaptations and mitigations, we think about upgrading poles, we think about undergrounding, but there are opportunities to sort of increase efficiency of inspecting and maintaining old equipment, which cause larger grid events that have deleterious impacts on the system as well. And some of those opportunities could be digitizing, record and inspection data. And I think another outcome here as well, which is important, is that sort of as part of this increase in wildfire in California, the CPUC has actually started to shift away from the risk spend efficiency requirement that they had for utilities when they're substantiating their investments, and moving towards actually arriving at financial impacts and conducting those business cases. And that's part of what we're talking about here, right? Is as we're evaluating these climate hazards, as we're evaluating the impacts to the assets, we want to push utilities and push stakeholders to start to quantify these effects so that we can build confidence in our substantiation of their investments.
Yeah, the other thing I'll reiterate, Paul, is that, again, these hazards don't occur in isolation. And so frequently you'll have adaptations that will address multiple hazards simultaneously, but also that you'll have adaptations that are competing for the same funds. And so you want to look at as many hazards as you can, as exhaustively as you can, because if you're looking at each hazard in isolation, then it's likely that the portfolio of adaptations you come up with will be suboptimal. And
Yeah, yeah,
we'll have more on that later on in the presentation.
yeah. We're hoping to cover some of the challenges and trade-offs across different adaptations and mitigations in the latter section here. But diving into the Dixie Fire, so pulling some data from the California State Auditor, approximately 19% of CAL FIRE reported acres burned between 2016 and 2020 are caused by electrical power discrepancies. And when we think about how wildfires occur from power-related equipment, they occur in two ways. One, you have old and faulty equipment that sparks and creates a wildfire. But two, and this is really important, and this is part of the reason why the Dixie Fire occurred, is that approximately 50% of all utility-started fires are due to foreign objects interacting with bare conductors. And I think this gets to this discrepancy between mitigation and adaptation, and really we want to be able to define what each of those mean. And in the case of wildfire, mitigating activities actually lower the likelihood of the occurrence of an ignition in the first place, while adaptation activities protect assets from the impacts of fires. And so there's a list of adaptations and mitigations on the left. And if we start with pole upgrades and pole wrapping, you know, those types of investments don't necessarily mitigate an ignition from occurring in the first place. Really, they protect the assets from the impact of a wildfire. If you jump to the bottom, we have covered conductors. And seeing that 50% of all utility-started fires are due to foreign objects interacting with bare conductors, implementing covered conductors would actually be a mitigation activity and preventing the likelihood of a wildfire from occurring in the first place. But going to Michael's point, there's a few of these that actually do both. And the primary one being undergrounding. Undergrounding is both a mitigating activity because the lines are underground. They don't have an opportunity to interact with any foreign objects, but they also protect the equipment from the effects of a wildfire. We think that this really illustrates well some of the trade-offs that decision makers have to make when they're going to select some of these investments. And when you're looking to award projects from the 401(b) funding on the wildfire side, you want to think, what is the outcome we want to drive here? Do we want to lower the likelihood of ignitions, or do we want to protect the equipment, or do we want to do both? And if we want to do both, what is the cost there? Because we all know that undergrounding is, one of the most costly investments to choose. Moving on, the next climate disaster that we want to cover is Winter Storm Elliott. So Winter Storm Elliott occurred in December of 2022. This was a low pressure system that hit the majority of the US, but primarily the eastern portion of the US, and it brought drastic cold conditions. But I think what's unique about Winter Storm Elliott wasn't that it didn't bring record breaking cold, but what happened was there was a significant and drastic drop in temperature. So over a 12-hour period, there was about a 30-degree drop between the min and max temperatures from night to day, and that caused significant issues on the grid. Approximately 6.35 million customers experienced interruptions across the eastern portion of the United States, and then there was impacts to generation as well. PJM lost about a quarter of its capacity, majority being natural gas plants. And so similarly to extreme heat, you have a decrease in capacity, in generation capacity. And then there's demand records. During Winter Storm Elliott, SPP saw a new winter peak record. TVA saw historical demand spikes during that time. And they needed to use load management programs and unfortunately sometimes rolling blackouts and curtailment to help meet that demand supply mismatch. One of the major outcomes of this was that PJM and other market operators took severe steps to revamp their cold advisory programs, their resource adequacy plans, and also their weatherization standards for fossil fuel plants. So talking through extreme cold, the effects are similar to extreme heat, but the impacts on the assets are slightly different. So if we look to the left here, the impacts of generation, especially during Winter Storm Elliott, were that the coal and natural gas facilities, the fossil plants, uh, we found that they weren't properly weatherized, and also they weren't prepared for the drastic decrease in temperature over such a short period of time. And so there were some wellhead freeze-offs, but primarily a lot of that capacity going offline was due to startup failure and ignition failures. Approximately 40% of natural gas facilities went offline in PJM during this event, which is very significant. So again, you have a decrease in supply, an increase in demand. Now, on the network side, with transmission and distribution, there isn't a derating effect that cold has. And in fact, cold itself doesn't pose much of a threat to transmission lines or distribution lines. But really what happens is when there's a coincident hazard that occurs. And what do I mean by coincident? When we have extreme cold temperatures, precipitation, and wind, you have significant impacts on network infrastructure, particularly on the mechanical loading of the assets. There's radial ice accumulation on the lines, which increases loading and stress on the poles and the transmission structure, which causes toppling. There's an interesting phenomenon here called line galloping, which I'm sure some of you know about, where the radial ice that does accumulate creates sort of a teardrop shape on the lines, which effectively acts as a car spoiler, accelerating a line movement when it's windy, causing clearance violations, the lines to interact with each other, and forces operators to sometimes de-energize the line. So when you have the coincident impacts from these hazards, extreme cold, precipitation, ice, and wind, there are significant impacts to network infrastructure, impacting sort of that stack of asset challenges that we've discussed earlier.
Paul, another point I wanted to make on in terms of like what all these cases have in common is it's not like these hazards are unique or new across the U.S., but in most cases, maybe with the exception of the fire, it was that an event like this had not occurred before for that part of the country. And so the assets are just not built to withstand these types of events. It reminds me, I live in Atlanta, and like if we get an inch of snow there, then the entire city shuts down. But of course, in the Pacific Northwest, that's not an issue at all. And so if you don't take into account the non-stationary nature of climate change, then it very well could be that events that you've never experienced before are now coming into play, and that's when the events that are most catastrophic occur. And the only way that you're going to be able to assess the likelihood of those unknown extremes is by using future climate projections, and in particular, because the assets that utilities are investing in frequently last multiple decades, the design choices that you're making on those standards of those assets, you're stuck with for a very long time. And so understanding these extremes and then the fact that they're increasing frequency and severity, as well as some of these other extremes that you may have never experienced before, is very key.
Yeah, Michael, that's a really good point. When we talk to a lot of utilities in the West, you know, we ask about extreme heat, for example, and obviously there are some areas of the West, Nevada, Arizona, some of the other states where extreme heat is commonplace. Some of the utilities that we talk to where it's not so common say that it hasn't been an issue. But as you'll find in the grid resilience reports, when we do the readouts, the climate projections show that, there are going to be days above 105 hitting, 10, 11, 12, 15 days a year. And that's obviously not the case now, but as we look out to mid-century, end century, these climate disasters are going to start to become an issue, and the utilities who are, the most experienced asset owners might not be prepared for those now. And so giving them the tools and learnings to be able to prepare for them will greatly benefit sort of the outage outcomes and the investment outcomes that they're looking to make. Just to close out on this slide and parlay into the utility experience, I decided to add a graph which chronicles TVA's experience during Winter Storm Elliott. What you have here is their actual demand on Thursday, their demand forecasts on Friday, their generation and purchase reductions and additions, and then any sort of energy demand, rolling blackouts, demand response programs as well. The reason why I added this here is because, when I've heard TVA executives present on this in the past, one of the major challenges from this event, and one of the major challenges in any wide area climate disaster event, are the import and export challenges between neighboring balancing authorities. TVA depends on energy from its neighbors in order to meet its supply. However, when everyone is experiencing the same derating effect on generation, the same derating effect on transmission, and the same demand spikes, there's not enough supply to go around. On top of that, there's sort of an interesting game theory effect where, grid operators are holding the supply that they have close to their chest during these uncertain situations, just in case they might need that additional capacity. So when you have a highly leveraged grid, when you're depending on capacity and energy throughput from your neighbors, you might not be able to get it in times of stress. And so bringing this back to when we have to make decisions around investments, thinking outside of the box, and trying to prioritize our generation assets to make sure that they're properly weatherized, prioritizing infrastructure that supports the transmission lines that are, the interties between balancing authorities, will actually prove to be resilient investments to make because of these challenges that we experience during wide area events. So the last climate hazard we want to discuss is Hurricane Beryl, and this is sort of fresh. It came through the southeastern portion of the United States, primarily Texas and the Houston area, in July of 2024. And it made landfall with about 165 mile per hour winds as a Category 1. And it moved through Houston, like I said, which is primarily CenterPoint territory. And it had significant impacts for customers. Approximately 2.1 million CenterPoint customers lost power, which is 75% of their base. The restoration efforts were significant, and there was a lot of mutual assistance. However, CenterPoint was only able to restore 10% of its customers within 6 days, which is a significant amount of time to be without power, especially with the following heat wave that occurred after that. And part of that was just because of the severe grid damage that we saw from this event. I have some figures in the bottom right there, about 3,000 damaged poles, 2,500 transformers, 150,000 feet of wire that had to be reconductored. And this was a really significant event. And when we dive into it, a lot of this could have been prevented through proper risk modeling. So to start with this, we have the National Electrical Safety Code design standards for wood poles in the top left there. And you can see that, the Beryl's wind speeds coming in at 165 are higher than both of those. One is for standard poles and one is for poles that is above 60 feet. So, obviously there's going to be pole failures, but I think what's significant here, specifically with wind and specifically with poles, is that a lot of the damage and the failures that we see are really dependent on the age and the condition of the pole. And so in order to accurately model this, you need to pull together what is called a fragility curve. And we have an example fragility curve on the right. And a fragility curve shows 3 different dimensions. One, it shows the wind speed, which we find on the x-axis. 2, we have the probability of failure of that pole, which we have on the y-axis. And then 3, we have the various curves, which represent poles of different age. And you can see that as the pole ages and we move those curves to the left, you're seeing an increasing sensitivity to wind. And just to step through this, for example, we have, let's hold the wind speed constant at about 100 miles an hour, represented by this dotted line here. We follow that intersection to the gray line. We find that a pole that is about 50 years old has a 10% chance of failure at 100-mile-per-hour winds. Now, if we age that pole 25 years to 75 years, and we follow this dotted line all the way up to this blue curve here, we'll see that the probability of failure actually jumps to 50%. And these are empirically derived curves that are standard across a lot of modeling. We found these in our literature review and have them sort of validated from engineers. Of course, you can build these specifically for certain utilities in certain service territories, and these may vary slightly. But it really gets at the dependence of pole failure on age and condition of the asset. Now, what does this have to do with Hurricane Beryl? Now, when we looked at the after action report, the independent after action report for Hurricane Beryl, they found that CenterPoint did in fact have a damage prediction model for their poles. However, the model only predicted 518 poles would actually fail, and that's 17% of the reality that occurred based on the 3,000 poles that we cited earlier. And the reason being was that one, it was a small training set that they used. They used Hurricane Ike data from 2008. 2, they didn't include vegetation density in the data, which is also really, really significant given that limbs and trees falling on poles is it causes a significant pole failure. But 3 is that they didn't use pole condition data, and they didn't use the fragility curves that we're going through here. And so when we think about modeling and we think about quantifying risk for asset failure, we want to make sure that we're doing it in an accurate way. And that includes using reliability data from the age and condition of the poles to really arrive at a dollar of risk and a damage model that accurately predicts the impacts of these events. So that's the conclusion of the failure modes and hazards section. What we want to move towards is some information around selecting adaptations. What is the state of resilience planning in the US right now? We're seeing movement among regulators to require resilience plans. Wildfire mitigation plans have been around for a while in the West, but there is significant traction being made. In the map to the left, all of the states that are colored have some sort of resilience requirement for investor-owned utilities to sort of substantiate in their reporting, which is not insignificant. Of course, there's a large section of the country that doesn't have any right now, but there is movement towards this being a priority and being a requirement of our large investor-owned utilities. There's various maturity across what the regulators require, but there are some significant early movers. Like I mentioned earlier, California is requiring within their resilience reporting quantification of benefits and financial impact rather than just keeping it at the risk spend efficiency score. And to help illustrate what selecting adaptations really looks like for a decision maker, we want to step through an example here. On the left, we have 3 types of needs, and these are priorities for grid planners. On the bottom, we have reliability. When we think about reliability, a lot of these, resilience, reliability have different definitions, but when we talk about reliability, we talk about sort of low impact, high frequency events, and that manifests as age and condition based replacements, age and condition based failures. On the top, we have resilience. And a lot of what we've been talking about has been resilience risk today. And when we say resilience, we mean high impact, low frequency events like the climate disasters that we've discussed. In the middle, we have capacity. And this refers to sort of new assets or upgrading existing infrastructure to address incremental capacity needs from load growth, whether it be from data centers, electrification, what have you. And so these are three network needs that really the planner has and the asset owner has they have to juggle and optimize for when making a decision as to how to invest their capital. And if I'm a planner, traditionally, what you would do is replace an asset like for like when an asset is nearing the end of its life. And that, moving over to the right side of the screen, is the scenario one at the bottom. You have an old pole, you replace an old pole with a new pole that is the same. And what that does is that reduces your reliability risk, right? The asset is new, it's not going to fail because of corrosion or what have you. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't help you mitigate and eliminate resilience risk. So, you replace a conductor like for like, mitigates reliability risk. But if you decide to underground that conductor, then you are eliminating and replace the conductor. You're eliminating reliability risk and eliminating resilience risk, which is that scenario number two, which is great and can be expensive yet effective. However, this isn't such a great scenario if the particular section of the distribution network has a housing development that is sort of coming online, and you're going to be seeing demand growth at the end of that feeder. So you decide to upgrade, and 5 years, or excuse me, you decide to underground, and 5 years down the line, there's new demand there, and you need to upgrade the infrastructure. You engage with a costly investment such as undergrounding, and then you have to prematurely, dig up that line, replace it, and then, re-underground it, which is very, very expensive, very inefficient way of using your capital. And so if we can model and we can think about optimizing all of these network needs simultaneously in an integrated way, we can make smart decisions of how to use our capital most effectively. And so by accounting for that demand growth and accounting for the resilience risk that we see in the climate projections per se, we can decide as a planner to upgrade the capacity of that conductor and underground that line at the same time. And that will be able to eliminate or at least address all three of these needs and optimally allocate your capital. But in order to make those decisions, we need to know what is in the art of the possible for investments. And so what we've done here is put together a list of some of the most common adaptations and mitigation investments, and identified on an HML scale their cost and mapped the hazards that they help address. Now, it's our sort of view that this kind of information would be insufficient to actually pull together an effective capital plan. However, we wanted to provide you guys with a bit of a cheat sheet for making more strategic sort of prioritization decisions around which type of investments are appropriate for which types of hazards. And just to be clear, this deck will be sent out after the call. There's a lot of information in here that I wasn't able to go over, particularly around the quantification of some of these effects and the relationship between failure and hazard. So if you guys are really interested to dive in, feel free with the deck and let me know if you have any questions afterwards. But I want to pull the modeling thread just a little bit more here. We've provided you with a cheat sheet for investments, but how do you actually start to think about modeling failure and arriving at some sort of risk quantification? And so we've put together some thoughts on the different types of data that you would need in order to perform this. And like Michael said, the first step here and really the best practice is using climate projections. Given the non-stationary nature of climate change, extreme weather isn't going to behave as it did in the past, and so you'd be inaccurately prescribing risk if you were to use historical data. There's a lot of really great projections that are publicly available that we're using in our grid resilience reports for you guys, but there is downscaled data products out there as well, which will actually allow you to arrive at a risk value for at the asset level rather than at a higher spatial resolution. The second important thing here is incorporating asset data. That's a given. You need which asset classes you're actually modeling this risk for. So that's whether it be poles, transformers, natural gas facilities on the generation side, and then you need their GPS coordinates, their lat longs, so that you can overlay the assets on top of what the climate projections are saying. The last bucket we have here is reliability data. This is data that is very asset specific, calling back the fragility curves for the extreme wind modeling, the age and condition data would slot right into the reliability data here. And this might not necessarily be necessary for the modeling, but it significantly increases the accuracy, and in CenterPoint's case would provide them with better information to make decisions around how many poles would actually fail based on their condition in a Hurricane Beryl like situation. And then when we think about asset resilience and the journey that utilities are on and other energy stakeholders are on, we're seeing quite a bit of varying maturity. And so what we wanted to sort of leave you guys with are 3 different levels of sort of maturity for understanding extreme weather risk to assets. And we've bucketed them into these 3 categories here. On the first side, we have types of analysis that's more strategic. This is a qualitative assessment of future risk. Oftentimes, when we see utilities and other asset owners perform this, it's using historical data. Like we've mentioned many times, best practice would include climate projections. There's course projections that are available at 15 to 25 kilometers. Oftentimes they're publicly available, and the commentary that can be derived is just by asset class. Now, this information is very useful, but it's only useful on a strategic level. And this is sort of akin to the grid resilience reports that we're pulling together for you guys. They're useful to understand generally where the risk is going to be and how assets are impacted, but it doesn't really arrive at a specific quantitative measure for risk. And that brings us to the second category here, which is actually conducting an asset vulnerability assessment. An asset vulnerability assessment is a quantitative assessment of future risk, and it requires high resolution projections of how the climate's going to behave. And rather than having this work be done at the asset class level, it's actually going to be done at the asset level itself. Now, there's a lot of utilities who have engaged in this type of work. However, oftentimes they sort of prescribe a risk score to assets, which is good, but really what we want to do is use this as a quantitative substantiation for investments. And the only way to confidently do that is to quantify the dollars of risk. And so that would be sort of the best practice here under this second stage. A good example of this would be the Southern California Edison's CAVA report. While they didn't arrive at dollars of risk, it's a very comprehensive physical vulnerability assessment that I would highly recommend everyone on this call check out. But again, it hasn't made the jump to quantifying dollars of risk, which leads us to our last bucket here. And this is sort of the final maturity, the best practice in regards to resilience risk modeling, which is the climate adjusted asset investment plan. Doing all this work, the point of it is pulling together a grid plan and an asset investment plan that is climate adjusted and addresses all 3 of those risks that we've talked about previously. And what this requires is really leveraging the outputs from a quantitative asset vulnerability assessment and pulling together and evaluating the financial metrics of investments. So whether you want to use the net present value or the benefit cost ratio, this will be able to this final stage will allow you to rank different types of investments through building a business case, through quantification of the benefits and the costs, so that we can have confidence in making investment grade decisions. Now, there's not a lot of sort of industry examples that we can pull and look towards right now. There's a lot that are sort of in development, and there's progress being made both on so the regulatory side with resilience requirements, and then also on the utility side too. But this is sort of the gold standard of where we want to push the industry, and as we move across these buckets here, what we're doing is really increasing the efficiency of capital allocation so that you can buy down the most risk for the least amount of dollars. I'll end the formal presentation there. Looks like we're generally on time. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions here, but I'm going to open up to the group. Feel free to chime in if you have any questions, and if not, we'll try to address any questions that have been asked in the chat as well.
This
Casey, are
is
there? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
this is Kyla in Montana. I was just curious. So, you talked a little bit about undergrounding, and it being both an adaptation and mitigation investment, but then talked about considering if there's a housing development there, then that would be a concern if there's load growth associated with that, and how that gets incorporated into the investment analysis. Is there ways to also think about how other hazards might play with an investment like undergrounding, such as, increased flooding risk, um, other hazards that are outside of the specific one you may be looking at?
Yeah, I can take that one,
Yeah.
Paul. You're absolutely right. Like every asset that is outside is going to have some sort of exposure to an extreme weather hazard, and so you're making trade-offs. So you're absolutely right. Like assets that are underground, depending on where they are, could be potentially flood prone. We've seen that with some of the underground networks up in the Northeast. But of course, if you're in an area that doesn't have substantial rain and you've got good stormwater management, then maybe that's not as big of a concern. But yeah, I mean, this is why it's so important to not be looking at hazards in isolation, because you may have residual risk that would make the NPV of an investment no longer attractive.
John, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. This is John from Colorado. Thanks for the presentation. I'm just interested in you're talking about those climate-adjusted assessment investment plans, and that there's some that are in development. Is Baringa working with any organizations on those, or those other organizations? And I'm curious what the timeline to get initial reports out at that level are.
Yeah, we are with other utilities. Frequently, that work is done under attorney-client privilege for the purposes of discoverability. So, not at liberty to say the utilities that we're working with. But what I can share is that Baringa, along with a lot of other affinity members, are active participants in EPRI's Climate Ready initiative. If you're not familiar with that, would strongly encourage you to take a look. They're working on similarly defining a standardized framework, and we're actively applying that framework, as well as kind of adding our own methodology or supplementing it with our own methodology here. But that initiative has 44 different 44 or 50 different utility members, and we've been active participants in that for the last 3 years. different utilities are in different stages of maturity on their resilience journey. But there have been very few, if any, utilities that have actually like explicitly linked downscale climate projections into investments. And so that's why we're on this call today. We're trying to help utilities figure out how to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Any other questions from the group? Casey, were there any questions that were asked in the chat that were not able to get addressed that we could talk to now?
Yeah, so just seeing one here from Larry from Washington. Just a question about maybe a concern that under-resourced co-ops and munis might not be able to kind of afford this sort of modeling, particularly the climate-adjusted investment plans. So kind of wondering how, what sorts of options there might be for those sorts of utilities and how that kind of connects with phases 3 and 4 of our analysis here with Gracie.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Baringa won't be conducting an asset level vulnerability assessment or having a climate adjusted investment plan as part of this program. There could be opportunities in the future for addressing that gap. But a very good point. Oftentimes, the utilities who are furthest along in this journey are the IOUs because they have the funding to engage in these resilience this type of resilience analysis, and they're required to by the regulator in some states. But I think what's interesting here and is a really good opportunity for the smaller utilities is that oftentimes the main driver of cost are for this type of analysis are the climate projections. And so if you can pool together certain utilities that are within a state or within a certain geographical area, then you can actually take advantage of the economies of scale and sort of drive down the cost for each utility by them being able to leverage the same climate points. So that's a strategy that we've been bringing to some of the smaller guys that has seemed to work pretty well, and hopefully that makes it much more attractive and much more affordable. Just on the demand side, I'll note that we've gotten a lot of attention from the smaller utilities. The smaller utilities are interested in undergoing this type of analysis and learning more. So there's definitely interest. There's definitely interest there, and it's a matter of trying to make the puzzle pieces fit together on the sort of the cost and resourcing side for them. Any other questions in the chat, Casey?
That's all I'm seeing right now.
Okay.
Larry made a similar comment. I just wanted to confirm. Yeah, okay. He said VIX. Yep.
Great. Well, we have 1 minute left. Any last questions from the group? All right. Well, we'll end there. Thanks everyone for attending. Again, this is recorded and will be released publicly so that you guys can share it with your colleagues or any other stakeholders that are interested in this information. Looking forward to meeting with the rest of you on the grid resilience readouts. Again, if you need to schedule anything, please let me know. I'll follow up with you after the call, and then on the utility front too. If you have any last minute nominations, please let us know. But thanks again, and looking forward to working with you guys on the remainder of the project.